Maybe standing is better exercise anyway, my daughter-in-law said at my grandson's birthday party after I realized there was no seat for me anywhere in the yard. Everyone laughed softly. Not because it was funny, but because pretending not to notice was easier than admitting what she had just done. I smiled anyway. At 68 years old, I had learned that humiliation arrives quietly. Sometimes it comes wrapped in pastel balloons and birthday banners. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I'm Helen Whitmore, and until that afternoon, I still believed there was a place for me in my son's family. The backyard of the rented event house looked like something out of a magazine. White folding chairs lined up beneath strings of warm lights. Blue and silver balloons floated over the pool. A giant inflatable slide towered over the grass while children screamed and laughed in the July heat. The smell of grilled burgers drifted through the air along with sunscreen and fresh-cut grass. Vanessa had gone all out for Lucas's 8th birthday party. At least, that was what everyone believed. What none of them knew was that I had paid for almost all of it. The venue. The catering. The custom cake shaped like a baseball stadium. Even the magician currently pulling scarves out of his sleeve beside the patio. Ethan had called me 3 months earlier sounding exhausted. "Mom, things are tight right now," he had said carefully. "Vanessa really wants to give Lucas a special birthday this year." I understood what he was asking before he finished the sentence. I always did. So I wrote the check quietly, just like I always had. I told myself it was worth it to see my grandson happy. I arrived 15 minutes early carrying a neatly wrapped gift almost as tall as my waist. Lucas had mentioned 6 months ago that he wanted a real telescope after learning about planets at school. I spent weeks researching before buying one that cost nearly $900. Too expensive, maybe. But seeing excitement in my grandson's eyes still made me feel useful. The moment I stepped into the backyard, Vanessa barely looked at me. "Oh good, you made it," she said distractedly while adjusting floral centerpieces on one of the tables. Her blonde hair was perfectly curled, her white summer dress crisp and spotless despite the heat. Everything about her always looked controlled. Calculated. "Where should I put Lucas's gift?" I asked. "Just leave it near the kitchen for now," she replied quickly before turning toward another guest with a bright smile that somehow disappeared whenever she spoke to me. I carried the large box through the patio doors and immediately noticed something strange. Every table had assigned seating. Small blue cards rested above polished plates with each guest's name written in elegant script. Ethan and Vanessa sat at the center table beside Lucas. Friends and relatives filled the surrounding seats. I walked from table to table slowly, scanning every card. Melissa. Jordan. Aunt Denise. Coach Tanner. Even neighbors I barely recognized had designated places. But not me. At first I assumed there had been a mistake. I checked again. Then again. My chest tightened slowly as realization settled over me like cold rain. There was no chair for me anywhere. Near the fence stood a single empty corner beside a trash bin and stacked coolers. No plate. No table setting. Nothing. I stood there holding my purse against my ribs while guests continued arriving around me. Nobody said anything. Nobody asked where I was sitting. They simply avoided looking too closely, the way people do when they witness something uncomfortable in public. Then Vanessa noticed me standing there. She walked over holding a tray of lemonade glasses, her smile polished and effortless. "Oh no," she said lightly, glancing around with fake surprise. "Looks like we forgot about you." A few nearby mothers chuckled awkwardly. Vanessa tilted her head. "But honestly, Helen, maybe standing is better exercise anyway." My fingers tightened around my purse strap. For one brief second, I thought Ethan might say something. He was only 10 feet away arranging party favors beside Lucas. He heard her. I know he did. But he kept his eyes on the table. My son suddenly seemed very interested in napkins. It's all right, I said quietly. My voice sounded calm even to me. I'm sure I can find somewhere. Vanessa smiled as if I had just solved an inconvenient little problem for her. Perfect, she replied before walking away. I moved toward the edge of the yard near the dessert table where nobody would notice me standing alone. The sun felt hotter suddenly. Children ran past carrying slices of pizza while music drifted softly through outdoor speakers. Every chair in the yard filled one by one until the empty feeling inside my chest became impossible to ignore. I watched Lucas laughing beside his friends while Ethan snapped photos near the pool. And standing there alone beneath those bright birthday decorations, I realized something painful. This wasn't an accident. People do not accidentally forget the woman who paid for the entire party. They forget her on purpose. I stayed near the dessert table for almost 20 minutes pretending I was interested in the decorations while parents settled into conversations around me. The music grew louder as more children crowded near the pool, their sneakers slapping against the concrete patio while waiters carried trays of lemonade and sliders through the yard. Nobody asked me to sit down because there was nowhere for me to sit. A strange thing happens when people decide you no longer belong somewhere. They stop seeing you completely. You become part of the background like a lamp or a fence post. I watched Vanessa move through the party with perfect confidence, touching shoulders, laughing loudly, complimenting guests on their outfits as though she had spent weeks personally planning every detail. Every few minutes she pulled out her phone to record videos for social media. Lucas's best birthday ever, she announced cheerfully into the camera while standing beneath the balloon arch I had paid for. I noticed she never filmed the corners of the yard where I was standing. Ethan finally walked over carrying 2 paper plates stacked with cake slices. Relief flickered through me for half a second. Maybe he had noticed. Maybe he felt embarrassed enough to fix it quietly. Mom, he said softly, avoiding direct eye contact, Vanessa is stressed today. Try not to take things personally. I stared at him. Not because of what he said, but because of how familiar it sounded. Those words had become his favorite shield over the past few years. Every uncomfortable moment somehow became my responsibility to absorb gracefully. I am not upset, I replied carefully. I was just looking for a place to sit. Ethan glanced around quickly before lowering his voice. The seating chart got complicated. There were more people than expected. I looked directly at the 20 empty rental chairs still folded beside the garage wall. He followed my eyes and swallowed hard. I will figure something out later, he muttered before walking away again. Later. That word sat heavily inside me. Later usually meant never. I picked up a glass of water from the refreshment table and moved toward the side fence where shade from a maple tree stretched across the grass. From there I could see Lucas opening gifts at the center table surrounded by children. Vanessa knelt beside him dramatically each time he unwrapped something expensive. Look what mommy got you, she kept saying for the cameras even when I recognized toys I had personally purchased weeks earlier. Then Lucas reached for the telescope box. My chest warmed slightly despite everything. He tore through the wrapping paper with excitement. No way, he shouted. A real telescope? Several adults turned to look. Lucas jumped to his feet holding the picture on the box toward his friends. This is the one from the Science Museum, he yelled. Before I could even smile, Vanessa stepped in smoothly. Your dad and I knew you wanted it, she announced brightly while rubbing Lucas's shoulders. Ethan looked startled for a split second but said nothing. Absolutely nothing. The children crowded around Lucas while he talked excitedly about planets and stars. I stood 30 feet away listening to my grandson thank his parents for a gift they did not buy. Something inside me shifted then. Not shattered. Not exploded. Just shifted quietly into place like a lock turning inside an old door. The humiliation itself hurt less than the realization that this had become normal. I began replaying other moments from the past 2 years. Christmas morning when Vanessa cropped me out of the family photo before posting it online. Easter brunch when my place card had been moved beside the kitchen entrance while everyone else sat together. The school concert Lucas invited me to where Vanessa suddenly claimed there had only been 3 tickets available. At the time I told myself these things were misunderstandings. Small accidents. Oversights. But standing alone beneath that maple tree while my daughter-in-law accepted credit for my gift to my grandson, I finally understood the pattern. Vanessa was not trying to insult me openly. That would have been easier to confront. Instead, she erased me slowly, one small humiliation at a time, until even my own son treated my exclusion like something natural. "You are Lucas's grandmother, right?" a woman beside me asked suddenly. I turned to see a silver-haired woman holding a paper fan against the heat. I recognized her vaguely from previous school events. "I am Margaret Cole," she said kindly. "My granddaughter Emma is in Lucas's class." "Helen Whitmore," I replied. Margaret glanced toward the crowded tables and then back at me. Her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I noticed there does not seem to be a seat for you." The embarrassment hit harder hearing someone else say it aloud. I forced a small smile. It was probably an oversight. Margaret looked unconvinced. "At my age," she said quietly, "I have learned there is a difference between being forgotten and being excluded." For a moment neither of us spoke. Children screamed happily near the inflatable slide while the birthday music looped again through the speakers. Then Margaret reached behind a nearby storage table and unfolded an extra white chair. She placed it beside her own seat at the far edge of the yard. "No grandmother should have to stand at her own grandson's birthday party," she said gently. I looked at the chair for several seconds before sitting down slowly. Across the yard, Vanessa noticed. Her smile disappeared for the briefest moment before she turned back toward her guests and lifted her phone for another picture. But this time, for the first time all afternoon, I noticed something else too. She looked nervous. After I sat beside Margaret, I kept my hands folded carefully in my lap and watched the party continue as though nothing unusual had happened. That was the strangest part about humiliation. Life kept moving around it. Children still laughed. Music still played. Ice clinked inside lemonade glasses while adults discussed summer vacations and school districts as if an elderly woman being quietly erased from her own family was perfectly ordinary. Margaret handed me a paper napkin when she noticed I had not touched my slice of cake. "Chocolate with buttercream," she said softly. My granddaughter insisted I try it. I smiled politely and set the plate down untouched beside my chair. The thick summer heat pressed against the backyard like a heavy blanket. Across the lawn, Vanessa stood beneath the balloon arch posing for pictures with Ethan and Lucas while guests gathered around them. Every few seconds her laughter floated across the yard, bright and practiced. She looked like the kind of woman lifestyle magazines loved to feature. Beautiful family. Beautiful home. Beautiful parties. Nobody looking at her would ever imagine how expertly she could make another person disappear without raising her voice once. "How long has it been happening?" Margaret asked quietly after a while. I turned toward her slowly. "What do you mean?" She adjusted the thin silver bracelet on her wrist before answering. "The exclusion." The word landed gently but accurately. I looked back toward the crowded tables. "I suppose I did not want to notice it at first," I admitted. "People make excuses for the ones they love." Margaret nodded as though she understood completely. "Especially mothers." That sentence sat between us for several moments. Nearby, Lucas opened another stack of gifts while parents clapped and recorded videos on their phones. I watched my grandson carefully. He still smiled at me whenever our eyes met. That was what hurt most. He loved me naturally. Innocently. The distance had not come from him. It had been built around him piece by piece until even simple moments with his grandmother required permission from someone else. Lucas talks about you all the time at school events, Margaret said. Emma says he is always proud of his grandmother. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Really? Last spring during the science fair he told everyone you helped him build his volcano project. I stared down at my hands. I remembered that project clearly. Ethan had forgotten to help him because of work, so Lucas and I spent 2 afternoons in my garage painting cardboard mountains and mixing baking soda experiments. Vanessa arrived only long enough to take pictures once it was finished. Online, she wrote an entire post about family teamwork and motherhood. My name was never mentioned. A waiter carrying trays of fruit passed by our table. As he leaned forward to offer refreshments, he hesitated briefly before asking, "Ma'am, are you seated here now?" Not seated here originally. Seated here now. Even strangers could sense the awkwardness surrounding me. Yes, Margaret answered firmly before I could speak. The young man nodded quickly and walked away. Margaret sighed quietly once he left. People always notice more than families think they do. Across the yard, Vanessa suddenly walked toward us with measured confidence. Her smile returned, but this one looked tighter around the edges. "Helen," she said sweetly, "I hope you are doing all right over here." Over here. Like I had been relocated. "I am fine," I answered calmly. Vanessa glanced briefly at the extra chair beneath me before turning toward Margaret. "I do not think we have met." "Margaret Cole," Margaret replied evenly. "Emma's grandmother." Vanessa nodded politely, though I noticed the flicker in her expression when Margaret did not smile back immediately. "Well, thank you for keeping Helen company," Vanessa said. "Big parties can get overwhelming for older people." Older people. I almost laughed at how carefully cruel she could be. "Actually," Margaret replied before I could answer, "Helen seems to be handling herself quite gracefully." Vanessa's smile froze for half a second. Tiny moments like that fascinated me. People like Vanessa depended on silence. On polite discomfort. The instant someone gently challenged their behavior, they became unsettled because the illusion cracked. "Excuse me," Vanessa said smoothly before walking away again, though her shoulders looked noticeably stiffer now. Margaret watched her leave before leaning closer to me. "Cruel people rarely begin with large acts," she said quietly. "They begin with small humiliations. Small enough that everyone else feels uncomfortable calling them cruel." I looked down at the folded napkin in my hands. Every memory from the past few years suddenly appeared sharper. Clearer. Thanksgiving dinners where Vanessa assigned me the folding chair near the kitchen while younger guests sat comfortably at the main table. Family vacations I found out about afterward through social media pictures. Birthday dinners scheduled on evenings she knew I had doctor appointments. Each incident small enough to dismiss individually. Together, they formed something impossible to ignore. "I used to think if I stayed patient, things would improve," I admitted softly. Margaret gave me a sad smile. "And now?" I looked across the yard toward Ethan. My son stood near the pool checking his phone while Vanessa entertained guests effortlessly beside him. He looked tired. Smaller somehow than the boy I raised. "Now," I said slowly, "I think I finally understand my place in this family." At that exact moment, Lucas ran across the grass holding a baseball cap too large for his head. "Grandma," he shouted happily. "Come see my telescope later, okay?" I smiled at him genuinely for the first time all afternoon. "I would love that." Vanessa turned sharply when she heard him call for me. And for the first time since arriving at the party, I noticed something beneath her polished expression that she had not intended anyone to see. Fear. The rest of the afternoon passed beneath a strange layer of politeness that felt thinner every minute. Once I noticed the fear in Vanessa's eyes, I could not stop seeing it. She laughed too loudly. Smiled too quickly. Every time Lucas wandered toward me, she redirected him gently toward another activity before he could stay too long at my side. It was subtle enough that most people would never notice. But after years of ignoring the pattern, I suddenly saw every move clearly. Margaret stayed beside me through most of the party, and I found myself grateful for the quiet steadiness of another woman who understood how loneliness could exist even inside crowded places. Around 5 o'clock, the heat finally softened as long shadows stretched across the lawn. Parents began gathering gifts and calling children toward their cars. Folding chairs scraped against the patio while leftover cake disappeared into cardboard boxes. I stood slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from my pale blue blouse, and reached for my purse. "Leaving already?" Margaret asked kindly. "I think it is time," I answered. My voice sounded calm again. Almost detached. Earlier that afternoon I had felt embarrassed. Hurt. Small. But now something colder had settled inside me. Clarity. Before I could head toward the driveway, Lucas came running across the grass with flushed cheeks and grass stains on his sneakers. "Grandma, wait," he said breathlessly. He grabbed my hand and pulled me excitedly toward the side patio where several unopened gifts still sat stacked against the wall. "I want to show you the telescope." His smile made my chest ache. "Of course," I said softly. Lucas knelt beside the large box and carefully touched the picture printed across the front. "Dad says we can set it up tonight," he said proudly. "Maybe we can look at Saturn this weekend." "I would love that," I replied. For one brief moment, everything else faded. The cruelty. The exclusion. The carefully staged humiliation. He was only a little boy excited about the stars. Then Vanessa's voice interrupted from behind us. "Lucas, sweetheart, your friends are waiting to say goodbye." Her tone sounded sugary, but tension sharpened every word underneath it. Lucas frowned slightly. "I am talking to Grandma." "And you can talk later," Vanessa replied smoothly while stepping closer. Her manicured hand settled lightly on his shoulder. "Right now we need to thank everyone for coming." Lucas looked disappointed but obediently nodded before running back toward the yard. Vanessa watched him leave before turning toward me. The smile disappeared from her face completely once we stood alone. "I think Margaret may have misunderstood the seating situation earlier," she said quietly. I looked at her evenly. "Did she?" Vanessa crossed her arms carefully. "You know how chaotic parties get." I said nothing. Silence unsettled her more than anger ever could. "Honestly, Helen," she continued, lowering her voice further, "sometimes you make things harder than they need to be." That sentence almost fascinated me. After everything she had done that day, she still needed me to believe I was somehow responsible for my own humiliation. I did not say anything, I replied calmly. Vanessa gave a short laugh without humor. "You did not have to. People notice your expressions. The way you stand there looking wounded." Wounded. As though pain itself were an inconvenience to her. I glanced toward the backyard where Ethan loaded coolers into the trunk of their SUV without once looking in our direction. "You know," Vanessa said quietly, "it would help everyone if you stopped acting like every family event revolves around you." I stared at her for several seconds. There it was. Not hidden anymore. Not softened beneath fake politeness. The truth underneath all those little humiliations. She did not merely want distance from me. She wanted me diminished. Smaller. Easier to ignore. "I paid for this party," I said finally. Vanessa blinked once, clearly caught off guard that I had spoken so directly. "Excuse me?" "The venue," I continued evenly. "The catering. The decorations. The cake. I paid for all of it." Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And?" she asked after a moment. Such a small word. Such an ugly one. "And nothing," I answered softly. I simply thought it was interesting to be treated like an unwanted guest at an event I funded. For the first time all afternoon, Vanessa lost control of her expression completely. Irritation flashed openly across her face. Helping financially does not mean you get to control everything, she snapped quietly. Nobody asked you to hold it over our heads. I almost smiled then because suddenly everything made sense. In her mind, generosity itself had become a threat. Every check I wrote reminded her that some part of their life still depended on me. Every gift Lucas loved connected him to me. She could not erase my importance entirely unless she first convinced everyone that I was emotionally difficult, oversensitive, burdensome. I never wanted control, I said calmly. I wanted respect. Vanessa looked away first. You always make yourself the victim, she muttered. Then she turned sharply and walked back toward the yard before I could answer. I stood alone beside the telescope box for several seconds listening to distant laughter fade into the evening air. Across the lawn, Ethan finally looked toward me. Our eyes met briefly. He knew something had happened. I could see it in the tension across his face. But once again, he looked away. That hurt more than Vanessa ever could. On the drive home, the sunset spread gold across the highway while old songs played quietly through my car speakers. I kept both hands steady on the wheel and replayed every moment from the party carefully inside my mind. The missing chair. The stolen credit. The comments disguised as jokes. Margaret's quiet observations. Vanessa's irritation once someone finally noticed what she was doing. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky had turned dark blue above the rooftops. I sat inside the car for a long moment without moving. Then I reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and searched for the number of the family attorney my late husband and I had used for nearly 20 years. My thumb hovered over the screen briefly before pressing call. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual even though I had barely slept. Pale sunlight filtered through the kitchen curtains while the coffee maker hissed softly beside the stove. For years, mornings had been my favorite part of the day. Quiet. Predictable. Safe. But that morning felt different somehow, as though something inside me had finally stopped pretending. I carried my coffee to the dining room table and stared at the framed family photograph sitting beside the window. It had been taken 5 years earlier during a beach vacation in Cape Cod. Ethan stood behind me with his hands resting on my shoulders while Lucas sat laughing in my lap, barely 3 years old at the time. Vanessa stood beside us smiling brightly toward the camera. Looking at the picture now, I noticed something strange. Even then, her smile never quite reached her eyes. My late husband, Richard, used to notice things about people long before I did. Kindness leaves traces, he once told me after meeting Vanessa for the first time. But so does resentment. At the time I thought he was being overly cautious. Richard had worked as a corporate attorney for nearly 40 years and trusted almost nobody immediately. I used to tease him about it constantly. Now I wished he were sitting across from me at the table so I could ask whether he saw all of this coming before I did. The house felt painfully quiet without him. After his death 3 years earlier, I focused almost entirely on Ethan and Lucas. I told myself family mattered more than grief. More than loneliness. Whenever Ethan hinted that finances were difficult, I helped. When Vanessa complained about daycare costs, I offered assistance. Mortgage payments. School tuition deposits. Medical bills after Lucas broke his wrist roller skating. Every time, I convinced myself I was supporting family. But sitting there alone that morning, I began wondering whether generosity without boundaries eventually teaches people not gratitude, but expectation. My phone buzzed against the table just after 8 o'clock. Ethan's name appeared across the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. Good morning, I said evenly. Hey, Mom. His voice sounded cautious already. I wanted to make sure you got home all right yesterday. Not I am sorry. Not Vanessa was out of line. Just careful emotional housekeeping. I got home fine. A pause settled between us. About yesterday, he began slowly. Vanessa thinks things felt awkward toward the end of the party. I almost smiled at the phrasing. Things felt awkward. As though discomfort had simply floated down from the sky instead of being deliberately created. Did she? I asked calmly. Ethan exhaled softly. Mom, she works really hard to make these events nice. I paid for the event, Ethan. Silence. Long enough that I could hear movement in the background on his end. A cabinet opening. Coffee pouring. I know, he admitted finally. And we appreciate it. Appreciate it. Such a small phrase after years of support. Do you? I asked quietly. He did not answer immediately. Vanessa feels like you judge her sometimes, he said instead. There it was again. The same pattern every time. Somehow the conversation always circled back to my tone, my reactions, my supposed emotional difficulty. Never the behavior itself. I looked down at the wedding ring still resting on my left hand even after all these years without Richard. Ethan, I said carefully, when your father was alive, he never would have allowed someone to treat his mother the way I was treated yesterday. Another silence. Sharper this time. That is not fair, he muttered. No, I replied softly. It is not. I ended the call a minute later after a few strained pleasantries neither of us meant. Then I sat quietly for several moments staring at the untouched coffee cooling beside me. Somewhere along the way, my son had learned that keeping peace with his wife mattered more than protecting the dignity of his mother. Maybe that realization should have devastated me. Instead, it simply clarified everything further. At 10 o'clock, I drove downtown to the office building where Richard's longtime attorney still practiced. The marble lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive cologne. I had not been there since Richard's will was finalized after the funeral. Walking back into that building alone felt strangely symbolic, like crossing into a different chapter of my life whether I wanted to or not. Daniel Mercer greeted me warmly when his assistant showed me into the office. He looked older now, his silver hair thinner than I remembered, but his eyes remained sharp. Helen, he said kindly while shaking my hand. It has been too long. Far too long, I agreed. He studied my expression carefully once we sat down across from each other. You sounded serious on the phone. I folded my hands neatly in my lap before speaking. I would like to review every financial arrangement connected to my son and his family. Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly, though he did not seem surprised. Attorneys who spend decades handling family estates learn to recognize certain kinds of pain immediately. Of course, he said gently. What specifically concerns you? I looked out the office window toward the crowded city streets below before answering. I think, I said slowly, I may have spent years funding people who no longer believe I deserve a seat at their table. Daniel remained quiet for a moment. Then he opened a thick folder, adjusted his glasses, and asked the question that would quietly change everything. Helen, he said carefully, how much control do you currently allow your son to have over your financial support? Daniel spent nearly 2 hours reviewing documents with me that morning. By the time we finished, several neat stacks of paper covered the polished conference table beside us. Loan agreements. Tuition transfers. Mortgage assistance. Vacation deposits. Emergency checks written over the past 5 years. Looking at the numbers collected together in one place made my stomach tighten. Not because of the money itself. Richard and I had been fortunate in life. Careful investments and decades of hard work left me financially comfortable even after his passing. What unsettled me was realizing how gradually generosity had turned into expectation. Daniel removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose while studying one particular file. Helen, he said carefully, you have contributed over $280,000 to your son's household since Richard passed away. Hearing the amount spoken aloud felt surreal. I stared quietly at the window while traffic moved below the office tower like streams of tiny silver insects. I knew it was substantial, I admitted softly. I did not realize it was that much. Daniel flipped another page. And according to these transfers, most of the educational accounts are still technically under Ethan's control. I nodded slowly. Years earlier, I trusted my son completely. Why would I not have? Ethan had once been thoughtful, protective. When Richard became ill during his final year, Ethan spent nights sleeping in hospital chairs beside him. I remembered watching my son hold his father's hand while discussing baseball scores just to keep him calm during treatments. Back then I believed grief would pull our family closer together. Instead, somehow, it hollowed everything out. Can those accounts be changed? I asked quietly. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Yes. Especially if you are the primary contributor. He studied me for a moment before continuing. But I need to ask directly. Are you trying to protect your assets from poor financial management, or are you preparing to distance yourself emotionally from your son's family? The honesty of the question almost relieved me. No careful phrasing. No pretending. I folded my hands together slowly. I think I am trying to stop rewarding people for making me feel unwanted. Daniel nodded once as though that answer made perfect sense. Then we should proceed carefully. By early afternoon we had restructured nearly everything. The educational trust for Lucas would remain intact, but Ethan and Vanessa would no longer have direct access or decision-making authority. Funds would become available only when Lucas turned 25 or for approved educational expenses monitored independently. Daniel also helped me draft revisions to my estate plan, including several charitable donations Richard and I had once discussed privately but never finalized. Sitting there signing documents felt strangely peaceful. Not vindictive. Not angry. Just clear. For years I had confused sacrifice with love. That morning I finally understood they were not always the same thing. When I returned home, I found 2 missed calls from Ethan waiting on my phone along with a text message from Vanessa. I think yesterday became unnecessarily uncomfortable. We should all move forward positively for Lucas's sake. I read the message twice before setting the phone face down on the kitchen counter. Not one apology. Not one acknowledgement of what actually happened. Only concern about discomfort. About appearances. I left the message unanswered. Around 6 o'clock that evening, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. Through the front window I saw Lucas standing on the porch holding the baseball cap from the party while Ethan waited beside the SUV in the driveway. The sight of my grandson instantly softened something inside me despite everything else. I opened the door quickly. Grandma. Lucas said happily before throwing his arms around my waist. Dad finally set up the telescope. I smiled down at him. Did you see Saturn? Not yet. But we saw the moon. His excitement radiated so naturally that for a moment I could almost pretend everything was normal. Ethan approached more slowly up the walkway with both hands shoved awkwardly into his pockets. He looked exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes like bruised shadows. Hey, Mom, he said quietly once Lucas ran inside toward the living room. I stepped aside to let him enter. The house suddenly felt tense in a way it never had when Richard was alive. Ethan glanced around the familiar rooms before speaking again. Vanessa said things got weird yesterday. I almost laughed softly at the understatement. Did she? He exhaled heavily. Mom, I know the chair situation looked bad. It did not look bad, Ethan, I replied calmly. It was bad. He rubbed the back of his neck the same way he used to as a teenager whenever he felt cornered. You know Vanessa gets stressed hosting these events. And you know your mother stood through most of her grandson's birthday party because nobody gave her a seat. Silence filled the room immediately. From the living room came Lucas's distant voice asking whether he could have cookies before dinner. Ethan stared at the hardwood floor instead of at me. I should have handled it better, he admitted finally. That was the closest thing to honesty I had heard from him in years. Yes, I said softly. He looked up then, surprised perhaps that I had not rushed to comfort him the way I usually did. Parents spend so much of life protecting their children from consequences that sometimes we forget adulthood requires discomfort. Ethan shifted uneasily beneath my silence. Vanessa thinks you resent her, he said after a moment. I walked slowly toward the kitchen doorway before answering. No, Ethan, I said quietly. Resentment requires emotional energy. I think I am simply beginning to see things clearly. His expression changed slightly at those words. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to uncertainty. As though for the first time, he sensed the balance inside our family shifting in a direction he did not fully understand. Over the next 3 weeks, something subtle began changing inside our family. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quiet shifts rarely announce themselves at first. They reveal themselves through delayed phone calls, tightened voices, and the uneasy feeling people get when the person they took for granted suddenly stops making life easier. I still spoke to Lucas regularly. Every Tuesday evening he called to tell me what he was learning in school or which planets he wanted to find through the telescope. Those conversations remained untouched by the tension growing around the adults. Children notice more than people think, but they also love more simply. Lucas never treated me like an obligation. Meanwhile, Ethan's messages became strangely careful. Before, he used to text casually whenever bills became overwhelming or unexpected expenses appeared. Now his words sounded measured, uncertain. As though he sensed an invisible door slowly closing but did not yet know why. One Thursday afternoon, I was trimming roses near the front porch when my phone rang again. Ethan. I wiped dirt from my gardening gloves before answering. Hello? His voice sounded strained immediately. Mom, quick question. Did something change with the education account? I continued clipping a dying rose carefully before responding. Yes. Silence. What do you mean yes? He asked slowly. I updated the structure of the trust, I explained calmly. Daniel Mercer handled everything. Another pause followed. Longer this time. Why would you do that without talking to us first? I almost smiled at the word us. Not you. Not Lucas. Us. Because it belongs to me, Ethan. His breathing sharpened slightly through the phone. The tuition payment for Lucas's private school did not process this morning. I know. The clipped response startled even him. I had spent years softening every sentence around my son. Cushioning discomfort before it could fully land. But clarity changes the way people speak. Mom, he said carefully, the school office called Vanessa directly. She was embarrassed. I looked down at the rose petals scattered across the porch steps. Pale pink against old brick. Embarrassment can be uncomfortable, I said quietly. Silence again. Then finally, frustration entered his voice openly for the first time. What is going on with you lately? There it was. Not concern about my feelings. Concern about my changed behavior. People become very unsettled when the person who always absorbs disrespect quietly stops cooperating. Nothing is going on with me, I replied evenly. I am simply organizing my finances more responsibly. Right after the birthday party, he pressed. This is because Vanessa upset you. I rested the gardening shears against the porch railing before answering. No, Ethan. This is because your wife showed me exactly where I stand in this family, and you stood beside her while she did it. His exhale came hard through the phone. You are blowing one misunderstanding completely out of proportion. I closed my eyes briefly. Even now. Even after everything. Still a misunderstanding. Was the missing chair a misunderstanding? I asked softly. He said nothing. Was taking credit for Lucas's telescope a misunderstanding? More silence. Was introducing me as emotionally difficult to other parents also a misunderstanding? That one landed. I could hear it immediately in the way his breathing stopped for half a second. What? He said sharply. Margaret Cole heard Vanessa say it herself. Ethan sounded genuinely shaken now. Mom, Vanessa would never. He stopped mid-sentence, and somehow that unfinished denial hurt more than if he had argued. Because for one brief moment, he realized maybe she would. I am not trying to destroy your marriage, I said quietly. I am trying to preserve my dignity. He lowered his voice after that. You know things have been stressful lately. Stress does not create cruelty, Ethan. It reveals it. Another long pause settled between us. Somewhere nearby, wind chimes stirred softly against the porch roof while a lawnmower hummed in the distance down the block. Ordinary suburban sounds. Strange how normal life continues even while families quietly fracture beneath the surface. What happens now? He asked finally. I looked out across the street where children rode bicycles beneath the afternoon sun. Lucas's education remains fully protected, I answered calmly. The trust will pay directly for approved expenses. Nothing changes for him. And for us? The question hung heavily in the air. I realized then that Ethan still viewed my support as part of the structure holding their household together. Not generosity. Infrastructure. That depends, I said softly, on whether you still believe your mother deserves a place in your life when money is removed from the equation. He did not answer immediately because deep down, he understood the question was no longer rhetorical. Before he could respond, another voice suddenly appeared faintly in the background. Vanessa. Ask her about the mortgage payment, she whispered sharply, not realizing I could hear her. Ethan lowered the phone quickly, muffling part of the conversation, but not before I caught enough. Mortgage payment. Of course. I leaned slowly against the porch railing as realization settled over me. For nearly 2 years, I had quietly covered part of their monthly mortgage after Ethan's business partnership collapsed during the recession. Vanessa had insisted repeatedly it was temporary. Necessary only until things stabilized. Yet somehow there was always another expense afterward. Another reason they still needed help. Ethan returned to the line sounding flustered. Mom, I interrupted him gently. I think we should stop discussing financial matters over the phone. His silence confirmed everything. Daniel will provide written details regarding the trust changes, I continued evenly. As for the rest, I believe some boundaries are overdue. Mom, wait, but I had already pressed end. I stood motionless on the porch for several moments afterward while the summer breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the neighborhood. Then, without anger or hesitation, I walked inside, opened the small desk drawer beside the kitchen, and removed the automatic transfer paperwork connected to Ethan's mortgage assistance. For a long time, I stared at the monthly amount printed neatly across the page. Then I picked up a pen. By the time November arrived, the silence between us had developed its own rhythm. Ethan still called occasionally, but our conversations had become careful and strangely formal, like two people trying not to step on hidden cracks in the floor. Vanessa stopped messaging me entirely unless it involved Lucas directly. I noticed she no longer posted family pictures online very often either. Something inside their household had shifted after the trust changes and the cancelled mortgage transfers. Not collapsed. Not yet. But pressure had begun settling into places once protected by my quiet support. I did not celebrate that realization. Contrary to what some people believe, older women do not enjoy watching their families struggle. We simply grow tired of being treated like invisible machinery expected to keep everything running while receiving no kindness in return. Thanksgiving arrived cold and gray that year. Bare maple branches stretched across the neighborhood like dark veins against the sky while wind rattled loose leaves along the sidewalks. Normally I hosted the holiday dinner at my house every year. Richard loved Thanksgiving more than Christmas. He used to wake before sunrise to start the turkey while jazz records played softly through the kitchen. After he passed away, I continued the tradition because it made the house feel less empty. But this year, for the first time in nearly 3 decades, Vanessa insisted on hosting instead. Ethan called 2 weeks earlier sounding nervous when he invited me. "Lucas really wants you there," he said carefully. I noticed he never mentioned Vanessa wanting me there. Still, I agreed to come. Not for them. For Lucas. When I arrived that afternoon carrying a homemade pecan pie, the atmosphere inside the house felt tight beneath the surface politeness. The dining room looked beautiful in the way magazine photographs often do. Cream-colored candles. Gold napkin rings. Carefully arranged eucalyptus branches running across the center of the table. Vanessa greeted me at the door wearing a fitted burgundy sweater and the same controlled smile she always used around guests. "Happy Thanksgiving, Helen," she said smoothly. Helen. Not Mom. Not even warmly polite anymore. Just distant enough to establish separation. "Happy Thanksgiving," I replied calmly while handing her the pie. She glanced at the dessert container briefly before passing it toward the kitchen counter without comment. Small things reveal people. Richard used to say that constantly. In the living room, football played quietly while relatives and neighbors mingled around appetizers. I noticed immediately that Ethan looked thinner than usual. Tired. His shoulders carried tension even while speaking casually with guests. Across the room, Lucas spotted me and ran over instantly. "Grandma," he shouted before wrapping his arms around my waist. The warmth in that child's voice still cut through every cold thing surrounding the adults. "Guess what?" he whispered excitedly. "I got an A on my science project." I smiled genuinely. "I knew you would. Mom says maybe next year I can join the astronomy club." His face brightened. "Will you still help me with the telescope?" "Always," I answered softly. Across the room, Vanessa watched us with that same unreadable expression I had begun noticing more often lately. Not anger exactly. Unease. As though she could feel something slipping beyond her control but could not fully stop it anymore. Dinner began an hour later. As everyone moved toward the dining room, I noticed the seating arrangement immediately. This time there was a chair for me. A proper one at the table beside Lucas. Beautiful place setting. Folded napkin. Gold name card written carefully in elegant script. Helen. I almost laughed quietly at the effort behind it all. Not kindness. Damage control. Vanessa gestured toward the chair with exaggerated politeness. "We made sure everyone had assigned seats this year," she said sweetly enough for nearby guests to hear. I met her eyes calmly before sitting down. How thoughtful. The meal began stiffly but peacefully. Turkey. Sweet potatoes. Green bean casserole. The familiar comfort foods of American family holidays. Conversation drifted around the table carefully at first until wine loosened people enough to speak more naturally. Then midway through dinner, Ethan's phone buzzed loudly beside his plate. He glanced down and immediately stiffened. Vanessa noticed too. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Ethan looked pale suddenly. The bank flagged the mortgage account. Silence flickered briefly across the table before conversations around us resumed awkwardly. Vanessa lowered her voice sharply. "What do you mean flagged?" Ethan swallowed hard while staring at the screen. The automatic payment did not go through again. Again. That single word revealed more than either of them intended. I continued cutting my turkey calmly while Vanessa's expression tightened. "I thought you fixed that," she hissed quietly. Ethan rubbed his forehead. "I am trying. Trying." Another revealing word. Across from me, Ethan suddenly looked smaller than his 42 years. Exhausted from holding together a lifestyle built partly on money that no longer arrived automatically each month. Vanessa noticed several guests glancing toward them now. Embarrassment flushed across her face instantly. "Can we not do this right now?" she muttered sharply. Ethan set the phone down harder than intended. "I am not the one who insisted we keep pretending everything was fine." The room fell suddenly quieter around us. Nobody openly stared, but people always listen more carefully when voices change tone at family dinners. Vanessa looked furious. "Excuse me? Maybe if we stopped spending money trying to impress people." Ethan began. "Oh please," Vanessa snapped softly. "Do not act like this is suddenly my fault." I sat quietly beside Lucas while tensions spread across the table like invisible smoke. Then Ethan said something that changed the entire room. "My mother paid half our mortgage for almost 2 years." Silence. Complete silence. Even the football game from the living room suddenly sounded distant. Several relatives stared openly now. Vanessa's face lost color instantly. She turned toward Ethan in disbelief. "Why would you say that here?" He laughed once without humor. "Because I am tired, Vanessa." His eyes looked glassy with frustration. "Tired of pretending we built everything ourselves while treating the one person who helped us like an inconvenience." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I slowly placed my fork down beside the plate while Vanessa sat frozen beneath the soft dining room lights. Then finally, very quietly, she turned toward me. And for the first time since I had known her, she looked ashamed. The rest of Thanksgiving dinner moved carefully after that. Conversations returned in fragments, fragile and uneven like people stepping across cracked ice. Nobody acknowledged Ethan's outburst directly, but the atmosphere around the table had changed permanently. Secrets lose power once spoken aloud. Vanessa barely touched her food after that moment. She kept her eyes lowered toward her plate while relatives exchanged subtle glances over wine glasses and half-finished slices of pie. For years, she had controlled the narrative carefully. Successful young family. Independent couple. Stylish home. Every polished holiday photograph had quietly erased the truth sitting underneath it. Now the illusion had cracked in front of witnesses. And no amount of carefully folded napkins or elegant centerpieces could repair that immediately. Lucas, thankfully, remained blissfully unaware of the deeper tensions surrounding the adults. He spent most of dessert explaining planets to his cousins using mashed potatoes and dinner rolls as imaginary solar systems across his plate. Listening to him laugh softened something inside me that had been hardening for months. Children deserve stability. Warmth. Not cold wars disguised as family dinners. When the evening finally ended, guests gathered coats near the front hallway while cold November wind rattled softly against the windows. I slipped on my wool coat quietly and reached for my purse near the staircase. Before I could leave, Ethan approached me slowly. His face looked drawn with exhaustion. "Mom," he said quietly. I turned toward him calmly. For several seconds he seemed unsure what to say next. Then finally his shoulders lowered slightly. "I should have stood up for you sooner." The honesty in his voice surprised me because it sounded genuine this time. Not defensive. Not carefully managed. Just tired and painfully real. I studied my son's face beneath the warm hallway light. He suddenly looked very much like Richard at that age. The same tired eyes whenever guilt settled heavily on him. "Yes," I answered softly. Ethan swallowed hard before continuing. "I think I kept telling myself everything was small enough to ignore." I nodded once. "That is how people slowly disappear from families, Ethan. One small dismissal at a time." His eyes dropped toward the hardwood floor. Behind him, I noticed Vanessa standing motionless near the dining room entrance listening silently. For once, she did not interrupt. Did not defend herself. Did not reshape the conversation. She simply looked shaken. Ethan rubbed his forehead tiredly. Things got out of hand financially after the business problems, he admitted quietly. Vanessa kept trying to maintain appearances. I kept letting her because I was embarrassed. There it was. The real truth beneath everything else. Pride. Image. Fear of looking unsuccessful. Sometimes people do cruel things not because they hate you, but because your generosity reminds them of their dependence. You could have told me the truth, I said gently. Ethan gave a weak laugh without humor. I do not think I even admitted it to myself. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then, unexpectedly, Vanessa walked toward us slowly. Her posture looked smaller somehow without the performance she usually carried so carefully. Helen, she said quietly. Not sweetly. Not theatrically. Just quietly. I waited. She clasped her hands together tightly before continuing. I owe you an apology. The hallway grew completely still. Even Ethan looked surprised hearing the words aloud. Vanessa looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. I was angry for a long time, she admitted softly. Every time Ethan needed help, every time you paid for something, I felt like a failure. I listened without interrupting. And instead of appreciating what you did for us, she continued, her voice tightening slightly, I started resenting you for witnessing how much we struggled. The honesty in that sentence landed harder than any excuse could have. That does not justify how I treated you, she added quickly. Especially at Lucas's birthday party. Somewhere deeper inside the house, football commentators laughed loudly through the television while dishes clinked softly in the kitchen sink. Ordinary holiday sounds drifting around an extraordinary moment. I looked at Vanessa carefully. For the first time since I had known her, she looked exhausted from carrying her own bitterness. Humiliation changes relationships, I said quietly. Even when it happens in small ways. Her eyes filled slightly though she blinked quickly to steady herself. I know. Another silence settled between us. Softer this time. Not healed. But honest. Ethan glanced between us uncertainly as though waiting for an explosion that never came. But older women eventually learn something important. Peace and reconciliation are not the same thing. I did not need revenge anymore because clarity itself had already changed the balance between us. I am not interested in punishing either of you, I said calmly. But I will not continue funding a life where I am treated like an inconvenience. Ethan nodded immediately. Vanessa lowered her eyes again. That is fair, she whispered. Fair. Strange how powerful that word sounded after so many years of emotional imbalance. Lucas suddenly appeared running down the hallway carrying a crumpled drawing in his hands. Grandma, wait, he shouted excitedly. He held up the paper proudly. It was a child's drawing of the Thanksgiving table done in thick colored markers. Everyone sat around the table smiling beneath crooked yellow stars. And there beside him, drawn carefully in blue marker, was me. I made sure you were next to me this time, he said proudly. My throat tightened unexpectedly as I stared at the picture. Children reveal truths adults spend years avoiding. I knelt slowly despite my aching knees and kissed the top of his head. Thank you, sweetheart. Lucas grinned brightly before running back toward the living room again. I stood quietly holding the drawing while cold air slipped through the doorway as another guest left outside. Then I looked once more at Ethan and Vanessa standing together beneath the soft hallway light. Family is not built by pretending people are invisible, I said gently. It survives by making sure they know they matter. Neither of them spoke after that. They did not need to. Because for the first time in a very long while, there was finally a place for me at the table. And this time, nobody could quietly take it away.